everyone. Welcome to our third session of this webinar series. Thanks for bearing with us. We're really pleased to have Stefan Pötzig here from GESIS, who will directly connect what we covered in the first two sessions about recruiting research participants through Facebook, but now focusing in particular on hard-to-reach populations. We will again use the Q&A function. So if you have any questions, generally, what we have covered so far, and of course, specifically for Stefan, please do use the Q&A function. Aykut and I will try to answer the more general questions, and then we have some time at the end for Stefan to answer any questions related to the topic of hard-to-reach populations. Okay, so with no further ado, I hand over to Stefan. The floor is yours, Stefan.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. And of course, thank you most of all for the invitation and the possibility to present this topic, which is very dear to my heart here in this webinar series. So as Anja just said, today I am going to talk about how we can use Facebook, the Facebook advertisement functionality to reach hard-to-reach populations. This is the agenda of what I have planned for us today, and let's get right to it. So first of all, it is of course important to think about what we are talking about, or what I am talking about, whom I am talking about when talking about hard-to-reach populations. So I'm building here and today on Turingo's definition of hard-to-survey populations. In this definition, Turingo differentiates actually 5 aspects of hard-to-survey populations. Now, however, today we're going to focus on the first 3 of those aspects, because that's where the Facebook advertisements functionality can help us to do our surveys, to reach our respondents. So these are hard-to-sample populations, for example, people for whom we have no other sampling frame. We can use the functionality to reach hard-to-identify populations, and populations which are hard to locate or to contact, for example, due to mobility behavior or because there are gatekeepers present. So the Facebook advertisement manager, just to recap very quickly, is the advertisement tool provided by the Meta Platforms Incorporated. Basically, this is the enterprise that until very recently was called Facebook Inc. still. It allows us, this online tool allows us to place advertisements on different networks that belong to Meta, namely and most importantly Facebook and Instagram, as well as in the Facebook Messenger and in Facebook audience networks. And also a nice thing is that once we have defined the target population, the FAM provides us already an estimate of our target group size, so that we can know whether we should actually change our targeting in some aspect or not, depending on whether the target size is bigger or smaller than what we had expected. Very quickly, just why is it actually a good idea, or do we think that it is a good idea to use Facebook for sampling purposes? There are different reasons here, different answers. Most important is the coverage of the different Facebook products. So all in all, we can reach 3.3 billion users with this. We have a nearly global coverage on the one hand, but on the other hand, also the possibility to do very fine-grained targeting. And we heard about this, most of this until now, what I said until now already in the last 2 episodes. We can use a high number of different targeting variables for the advertisements. This method is easy and fast to realize. It's open to all scholars as it uses Meta's business model, which means that we do not depend on some kind of cooperation with the firm itself. And it is much less expensive than most established sampling methods. And the final point which we want to talk about today mostly is that this targeting method allows us to reach hard to reach populations. So populations which we might not reach that easily with other sampling methods, namely, and these are just examples, of course, scattered populations, very mobile populations, members of specific small social subgroups, or individuals who are missing systematically from other sampling frames. However, where there are lights, there are also shadows. So of course, this method has its limitations. The limitations are mostly in the area of coverage. So obviously, the sampling frame does only include individuals that use A, the internet, and B, Facebook or Instagram. We have to take into consideration possible effects of digital divides. The targeting depends in part on the information entered by users in their profiles. Targeting variables are black boxes, meaning we do not really know what goes in and what doesn't. And people might also use more than one user profile, which might actually lead to overcoverage. Besides that, we also have a self-selection of participants, which might cause or increase biases and should be taken into consideration. In short, we have a possibility here to create a non-probability sample. And this has been discussed in more detail also in the previous 2 episodes. So take this into consideration when doing this, and maybe also go back to the former episodes to get some more detailed information on that. Additional limitations result from the fact that we rely on the meta infrastructure when using this method, meaning the algorithms computing the targeting variables may change over time, and they have done so in the past. There are new targeting options becoming available all the time, but also existing ones might be disabled. And you might have followed actually the discussion of this aspect in the media during the last weeks. And of course, and I assume many of you are also aware of that, there is always the risk of severe outages, as we had in October, if I'm not totally mistaken. So this could interfere with your fieldwork. But then again, of course, the last point also applies to many other sampling procedures or survey procedures where usually, or not usually, but in many cases, you rely on some kind of technical infrastructure, which could, of course, fail. Taking all these advantages and disadvantages into consideration, this method has already been used to target a number of different hard-to-reach populations, different in the characteristics which make them hard to reach. So we have a number of very interesting research projects in medical and health research, migration research. There has been research on LGBTQ communities, and also on people who are targeted because they work as professionals in specific industries or labor market sectors. So with that, I now want to come to the theoretical part of the presentation. Theoretical, not in the meaning of theoretical underpinning, but theoretical as opposed to practical. Quick reminder. So to follow what I'm about to present or to fully understand it, it's important to remind yourself, to remind ourselves what advertisement campaigns are actually structured like in Facebook. So advertisements, when you want to run them, you create an advertisement campaign which can feature one or more ad sets, and then those can feature one or more advertisements each. Importantly, the targeting happens on the ad set level, which means that you can use a number of, or you can combine a specific number of ad sets to create a quarter-like stratification for your targeting approach, for your targeting strategy. For example, if you want to target people in different world regions, and we will come to that, or different people who differ by gender, age, or basically any other target characteristic that you can select in the Facebook targeting, Facebook Advertisement Manager, sorry. Very important for me as someone who is doing mostly methodological research is that you should make use of URL parameters. I am not going to go into detail here, but basically these parameters will allow you to tell exactly for every observation in your data set which ad set or even which advertisement those respondents came from. And this can, of course, be very important if you want to have a closer look on the mechanisms behind your targeting approach. So let's first of all look at the targeting variables. There are a number of very straightforward targeting variables, which I put here on this slide. So if you want to use this approach, if we want to do advertisements on Facebook or Instagram, we have to select a location in which we want to use the advertisements and how users should relate to it. We can define an age. We can select specific gender. So here there are only 3 options. Facebook and Instagram, the Facebook Advertisement Manager differentiates only between male and female users, or the third option is to include both those categories. And then we can select specific languages that we want to target, meaning users using specific languages, for example, in their Facebook settings. To go into a bit more detail about the location targeting, so what does it actually mean, or what do I mean by how should users relate to locations? We can specify whether we want to target users who live in certain locations or who, for example, have been traveling to these locations. In most cases, in survey research, you would use the former, so people living in locations, I guess. Also important is that we cannot just include specific locations, but we can also exclude them. This might, for example, be of interest to you if you want to recruit the general population in rural areas of a specific country. Then you might want to exclude specific urban areas. So which are the options for location targeting? And here I'm only going to mention some, not all of them. There are more, and you should check out the Facebook Advertisement Manager for that. So most straightforward, and I think most well known, is the possibility to target specific countries or country groups, but we can also target provinces, federal states, or other subnational units. We can target specific cities and municipalities. We can also define postal codes in many countries. And we can even use circles around specific points, for example, around an address. So in this case, if we use the include option, the Facebook advertisements will only be distributed to people, in my example here, living in a 1 mile radius around the University of Glasgow, which obviously is a very small population and I suppose would not work very well for targeting. So besides these basic targeting variables, the FEM offers us a large range of additional, more specific targeting options. And here one difficulty, let's call it that, is that, at least to my knowledge, there's no conclusive list of, or comprehensive list, excuse me, of these targeting variables. So you will have to play a bit around with the targeting mechanism, but I put some of the variables here. So, and by the way, the wording I use here is that used by Facebook. So certain characteristics which I present later on as interests might, in common sense, also fall into demographics, but I tried to list them here so that you can find them more easily in the Facebook Advertisement Manager. Under demographics, we have the possibility to target specific people of specific educational levels, for example, people living in specific industries, which again, we will come to in a couple of minutes. But we also have, very interestingly, for example, a possibility to target people who live in specific categories of areas in the US, unfortunately only, which are categorized by household income. I think that is something that might also be very helpful in some research areas. But then we have also very specific categories, for example, newlyweds, and there's even a category for people who got engaged. So again, check this out if you have a very specific research topic in mind and see what kind of variables you have. Very often used, especially in migration research for obvious reasons, are the variables which are in the behaviors expat category. There we have one indicator which is lived in country X. So for example, lived in Germany. This variable, as the name suggests, is assigned to people who lived in a specific country. And besides that, we have a more general lives abroad variable, which is assigned to people who are not living in their country of origin, according to the information that Facebook has and analyzes. And again, we do not really know who goes into which category. That's kind of a black box. And then we have different interests that we can target. And here again, we can also, I told you before, we can target people who work in certain industries, but we can also target people who are interested in certain industries. And another possibility would be to target people who are interested in certain aspects of family life. And then the last big option is the use of an open text field to identify additional interests. So this sounds all very great, but again, of course, we have limitations here. And the thing is that in all the categories I just presented, there is only a limited set of predefined indicators. And this even applies to the just mentioned open text field, because the thing here is that while I can type in any word I'm interested in, I cannot not use it directly as a targeting characteristic, but then Facebook will suggest, or FEM will suggest interests that are similar to what I'm trying to type. So you can think about this functionality the same way as you would get proposed search terms in Google. It's basically the same thing. Then a more severe limitation even is that country and culture related indicators are not universally available. So the lived in country X indicator, for example, is only available for a limited number of countries. I mean, it is actually a list with at least 2 figures, but for important countries, especially of refugees at the moment, important countries of origin, we do not have these indicators, and I mentioned some here. And then the same applies to the language variable. This is available for many of the larger languages, but not for all of them. So if you think about Hausa, which is actually a language that is spoken widely in West African country, even this is not available, but also languages which are specific to certain social groups or region like Quechua in South America, you cannot select as a targeting variable. And then again, this is important. That's why I put it twice in my slides. We always have to take into consideration that at some point, Meta might actually deactivate targeting variables that have previously been used in research. So next year, there will be a number of variables that will not be available, or targeting options that will not be available anymore. And this will affect, among other things, sexual targeting based on sexual orientation, religious practices, and political beliefs. So what does this mean? Obviously, it means that not all hard-to-reach populations can directly be targeted using the Facebook Advertisement Manager. And this is why you should always take into consideration that targeting in this mechanism, in this method, means more than finding the right targeting variables. So we can differentiate between primary and secondary targeting elements. Primary elements are building on users' personal traits. So certainly this applies to the targeting variables, but also to aspects of the ad design. So I just told you that it is not possible to run or to select Quechua or Hausa as a targeting variable, but I can design an advertisement which uses text only in Quechua or Hausa. So naturally, the advertisement can only be understood by people who speak one of those languages, and those people will be much more likely than others to click on the advertisement. Then we have the wording, and I will present you some examples. Long story short, you should always try in the wording of your advertisement to directly engage the targeting population. And last but not least, we have the media elements in this group. So obviously you should put some thinking in the selection of pictures or videos, if you want to use those, that you will use in your advertisements. And then, of course, as I just mentioned, we have secondary targeting elements, which should also be taken into consideration, as they will influence the outcome, the results of our targeting campaigns, mainly the question which networks we use for the targeting. So Facebook, Instagram, both of them. Do we also want to place advertisements in the Facebook Manager? Then we have different possibilities for placements within those networks. And of course, it is important to consider which type of devices we are targeting. So just to recap that, direct targeting through targeting variables allows to identify many hard-to-reach populations, but successful recruitment also always depends on more than the right targeting variables. Not all target populations can directly be identified using the Facebook Advertisement Manager, and you should combine direct and indirect targeting to reach and engage your target population. And with that, I now want to come to the practical part of this webinar, practical in the sense that I want to present you some examples of my own research. So to be more precise, I will focus on 3 recent research projects, or rather the results, the data we got from them, and of course, the strategy we used for the sampling. Of course, though, this is research which I did not do all alone, and you have the collaborators here on those slides. More specifically, I'm going to talk about the targeting of German immigrants on a nearly global level, then of the targeting of refugees in Germany. So we go from the global level to a very specific, very clearly defined and limited local level. And then I'm gonna present some thoughts on the targeting of health professionals, so on the targeting of people who work in a specific industry. And you can already see on this slide that this is research we did during the last 2 years. We did all this with, in each case, with a rather small budget, but nevertheless reached, at least for us, sample sizes which were satisfactory, and we did so at small cost if compared to other sampling methods. So let's start this part. First of all, first is the recruiting of immigrants, as I said, on a near global level. Here we have a population which clearly differs in cultural and national origin from the general population in the countries these people live in. The target population, more specifically in this research, were Germans living outside of Europe, aged over 18. We targeted here specifically countries outside of Europe because there are already some methods to target immigrants, and these results show that those methods work best within Europe. So it was a conscious decision to target only countries beyond Europe. This is obviously, or this has been cross-national research, and the main challenges which the Facebook Advertisement Manager is used to help us with is that we are targeting a globally highly dispersed population, and one of which the settlement patterns are not fully known beforehand. So the good thing here is that FAM actually offers us all the variables we need to very specifically target those people we are interested in. Which are those variables? And I'm not going to go into detail here. I'm not going to read out all of them. The main targeting variables are geographic targeting, or targeting aspects are geographic targeting, the age, gender, and the lived in Germany variable, which we used. And when I said before that we can very specifically target this population, then this is mainly due to the two aspects highlighted here, meaning we can define which country people should live in that have a certain age, have a certain gender, and to which the Facebook AI assigned the lived in Germany indicator. Beyond those aspects on the previous slide, of course, and I mentioned that just some minutes ago, we have the questionnaire design elements, which help us with targeting. In this case, the questionnaire, ads, and Facebook page were all in German only. So this is the same aspect I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, that the advertisements could fully be understood only by people who actually are fluent in German, and the assumption being that those people would be more interested in clicking on them. We used the same advertisement text and one of the 7 pictures in all of the advertisements. And I also want to stress here again what I actually mean using this example, what I mean when I say you should try to target directly or to speak directly to your target population through the elements of advertisement design. You can see here that the short text used in this advertisement very clearly, again, defines the target population of those ads. So, are you from Germany and live abroad? If so, please participate in our survey. This is really clear. And then below the picture, you again have the short phrase Germans abroad, which should catch the attention of the target population. So this is a basic structure which so far we have followed in all our research projects, and which until now works or turned out to work really well. So that's what I would actually recommend. So what did we do in terms of location targeting? Obviously, we could not, or maybe it's not obvious, but it becomes obvious when you keep in mind that we had a budget of roughly over 2,400 euro only for this project, as mentioned on the previous slide. So in this case, it is kind of obvious that we could not target each country worldwide individually. However, we separated instead the world by continents first, and then targeted 2 to 3 regions, differentiated 2 to 3 regions on all continents. And in these, we targeted then 2 different age cohorts and 2 gender cohorts, which gave us a total of 52 ad sets in this research project. And multiplied by the 7 pictures, a total of 364 ads. And here are some metrics of the results in terms of sampling that we achieved by using this strategy. And I want to focus basically only on the table on the bottom of this slide. You see here that a total of roughly or shortly under 4,000 people completed our survey. And of those, 98% fall in the category of immigrants if we apply a broad definition, which means in this case that they were either born in Germany or held German nationality. And even 89% were immigrants in a more narrow sense, meaning that both of those aspects applied to them. So you can see that the targeting using the aforementioned 2 targeting aspects, namely location targeting and the lived-in variable, worked very well and delivered exactly what we were hoping it would. And again, it resulted in very low sampling costs, meaning in this case, we paid, depending on the definition of immigrants you use for this calculation, we paid between 62 or between 58 and 62 euro cents. Here you can see the distribution which we reached based on our location targeting approach. You can see that we actually have, and this is only, of course, referring to completed surveys. We have respondents in 148 countries and territories. Again, keep in mind, we used just over 2,200 euro for that. Still, we have subsamples of more than 50 respondents in 18 and more than 10 respondents in 53 countries. And we have subsamples of considerable size in a number of countries between 416 and 140 respondents in the countries I just put on this slide here. And at this point, I want to take a slight detour and talk about the added value of using Facebook and Instagram as a sampling tool in comparison to other sampling frames or sampling approaches. I just said in comparison, but with this, I do not necessarily mean that you can only use this, or you should only use this approach as an alternative, but in many cases, it might actually serve you well to combine it with more established sampling methods. So the most promising sampling method for to recruit German immigrants is a register-based sampling method used by the authors mentioned here. But this, while this method is very good and very innovative, it has several limitations. So it can only work if immigrants have actually, or only immigrants who have actually deregistered with German authorities are included in the sampling frame. It is most efficient if immigrants additionally registered a new address abroad. And the results of this method show that there are coverage issues if we look at countries which are beyond Europe, which again is actually why we tried, or why we started this research in the first place. So, and if we look more in detail, you can see here to which degree our respondents would actually be included in the register-based sampling frame. So what we basically did is we asked our respondents whether they deregistered with German authorities and whether they provided a new address abroad. And you can see that just 15% of our respondents did so. So of those 15%, we could actually be sure that they would be included in the sampling frame, in the register-based sampling frame, and thus it would be very likely that we could actually reach them with this sampling approach. On the other hand, we have 20% of respondents alone who didn't deregister at all. Then we have another 8% who did deregister, also provided an address, but are not longer living at this address and also did not update their information. We couldn't reach them. And we have also 17% of our sample who did not provide an address abroad, nor could they still be reached by their old address in Germany, via their old address. So these more than 40%, 45% of the sample, we could be rather sure that they would not be reached by a register-based sampling. So this shows very clearly the potential of this sampling approach, as we are able to reach people who would have been missed if we had used another sampling strategy. And then just very quickly, the same, or not the same, but also very positive results can be seen here. If we look at the geographic distribution, and this refers to the aforementioned bias. So GERBS is the other study that used this register-based sampling approach. Again, it is a great study, don't get me wrong, but within the short time frame used for our survey, and within or with the small amount of budget that we actually had, we were able to survey more people in the non-European sampling regions you see here than this big project. So again, this highlights, on the one hand, that the approach can be used for cross-national research on a large scale and might reach people that would otherwise be missed, and also that it can be implemented at very low cost and in a very short time frame. With this, I'm gonna come to the second example I want to talk about. And here, I'm referring to research we did on refugees in Germany. Again, we have a population hence that clearly differs in cultural and national origin from the target population. We specifically targeted Arabic-speaking refugees living in Germany and aged over 18. So here you see we all already narrowed the target population a bit. It was not refugees in general. This is obviously a national population. And we have to take into account the facts that, or the main challenges of other approaches here, which are that this population is unevenly distributed across Germany. So if we would want to do, for example, the location sampling, which is often done, then we probably could not sample people in the whole country, as we would have to send interviewers or people who do the sampling for us to different locations, and this gets very expensive very fast. Refugees are only partially included in other established sampling frames, and there's always the danger of gatekeepers. And of course, there are other limitations. Those are just examples. A drawback here is that we cannot directly target refugees through the Facebook Advertisement Manager, because, unsurprisingly, the FEM does not provide an indicator identifying refugees. And also, I mentioned that before, the lived-in variable does not exist for a number of, at the moment, numerically important source countries of refugees, Arabic-speaking refugees. So what did we do? Again, I'm not going to read out the whole list. So in this case, we used 3 different targeting or sets of targeting aspects. So the most basic one is that we targeted Arabic-speaking migrants, meaning we chose in Germany, we chose Germany as location, defined age, gender, and so on. We applied the generic lived abroad or lives abroad variable and defined language in the language indicator Arabic. On top of that, the 2 other sampling strategies differed from this one just in the aspect that they included an interest variable. And in strategy 2, this was interest in Syria, and in strategy 3, interest in Iraq. So these are the 3 different strategies. You should just keep this in mind for the upcoming slides. And again, of course, we had the targeting aspect of advertisement design. Everything was, in this case, in Arabic. In this research, we also offered a €5 postpaid incentive. We used the same text and one of 6 pictures. And here, besides the different targeting strategies that I just mentioned, we also used 2 different wordings or types of wordings, however you want to put it. The one being more neutral, just asking whether people came to Germany since 2015. And the other one, specifically including the word refugee, asking whether people came as refugees. With this, we wanted, on the one hand, to see whether we could, whether both versions, text versions, obviously work, but also we wanted to test whether the more specific wording that could also be seen as kind of sensitive in some contexts would actually have disadvantages in terms of sampling. Again, just some metrics of this campaign. And again, I will mainly concentrate on the table that you see on the bottom here. With our approach, we were able to collect completed surveys of 688 individuals. And of those, 608 or 88% fall into a category which we call here refugees broadly defined, which basically means this is self-identification. So we had an instrument in our questionnaire which allowed people to state the reason for their migration. And there we classified in this category those reasons that would fall into, or that would could be defined as forced migration. And the narrowly defined categories are people who have actually residence titles which are associated with refugees. So, but even if we look at this category, still 58% of the completed observations fall in the narrowly defined refugee category, given the fact that we only could use very indirect sampling. This is still a result which we find very good. And again, even though this sampling in this case was more expensive than in the other that I just presented, it is still much cheaper than more established methods. So if we talk,
Stefan, can I just interrupt you for a second? So I think maybe if you wrap it up in like 5 minutes, would that be okay?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So
because there are still some questions that would be great to go through.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I don't guess that. I know you will have the possibility to look at these slides later on. So I invite you to do that and have a look. So basically, for the moment, just take into consideration that all these 3 indirect sampling strategies actually worked rather well. As you can see here, the combination of interest with the general targeting criteria worked better when we use Syria than Iraq. And regarding the wording, I think this might be interesting also for some people that if we look at the total, we actually do not see a difference in the effect. But if we look at the different groups or targeting strategies, we can see that the neutral wording was responsible for a larger share of the recruitment in the more general targeting strategy. But when we combine these general aspects with the question whether people actually are refugees, then we recruited slightly more respondents using the specific wording. So the take-home message here is twofold. First of all, it does not seem to be the case that you lose potential participants if you use wording that might or might not be considered sensitive. And the other one is, and I have to be honest, we have to look in more detail into that, is that you actually might recruit people with different profiles by using those different wordings. So it's worthwhile doing it. 5 minutes. Yeah, let me just, because not all people might be might only be interested in migrants. So really quickly, targeting people who work in specific industries. That's the third project we did. Different to the first 2. Here we have no clear cultural or national difference between our our population of interest and the general population, which makes this population actually hard to identify within general population surveys. Again, in this case, we have a possibility to target them directly using the industry indicator I mentioned before. But if we do this, we have a very narrow and small target population, which is why, much like in the previous example, we combine 3 different strategies. So we targeted the general population in strategy 1, then used industry and healthcare and medical services in strategy 2, and not interest, the industry in strategy 2, and the interest in healthcare or nursing in strategy 3. So the difference is strategy 2 should be people who are actually working in healthcare, and strategy 3 should apply to people who might or might not work in healthcare but are interested in it. Again, our ads, I'm not going to go into details here. So as you can see, of the 3,132 people which we recruited using this approach, 98% were actually members of the target population. These targeting strategies worked very differently. So the share of people that we recruited with the general targeting is roughly equal to the share which we recruited when combining it with interest. On the contrary, the industry strategy did not work all that well in terms of absolute numbers, as we actually would have expected the contrary. But then again, we think it is still worthwhile selecting the industry variable in a targeting approach, because if you look here, you see that in relative terms, in this strategy, we in 2 specific groups of professional, this strategy was much more successful in recruiting respondents, namely amongst doctors and therapists. So if you would be interested in those specific professionals, it might actually be worthwhile, for example, to invest more of your budget in such a strategy. So again, the key here is think about what you want to achieve, and probably it is always a good, or not probably, it is always a good idea to test your strategy, to adjust it, and if need be, to reach your research goal, to maybe also shift the budget accordingly so that you can reach specific quotas if you have them in mind. Conclusions, very shortly, basically that's what already has been mentioned on previous slides as well. So, and in the previous 2 sessions also in part, the Facebook Advertisement Manager allows us to recruit how to reach populations in a timely manner, and on the one hand, on a global level, but also at the very local level. It does, however, not provide specific target variables for all possible hard to reach target groups. This is why successful targeting needs more than the right targeting variables. We should also always take into account and thoroughly think about the design of our advertisements in terms of advertisement campaign and single advertisements themselves. And it is also always worthwhile to combine different targeting strategies to optimize the targeting results. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stefan. That was great. And also kind of a very nice, kind of just continuation of what we have covered already in the first 2 sessions. And I would, anybody who wants to work with what Stefan presented today, do also have a look at the videos of the first 2 sessions, because they will help you to, kind of set up and the technical background, because there were a few questions about this, and I'm sure that's people who might have missed the first 2 sessions. We do cover that as well. Stefan, there are a few questions, so we have answered some of them along the way, but some are for you. So. Last week we actually had a question, and which I think is really good, which is about ethnicity. And have you used ethnicity in particular? So that was, kind of, I think maybe somebody referring specifically also to research in the US. But any experience with using ethnicity, and is ethnicity something that Facebook actually, covers as a targeting demographic? Do you know anything about that?
So your question has 2 parts. No, I have not used ethnicity. That is the first answer to the first question in my own research. I'm actually not sure whether such a variable is still available. And I mean, you were referring to the US, so I assume at least that what is meant by ethnicity might be what is usually under the label of race in the US. So could you target Black people, African American people, however you want to phrase it? I'm not sure whether this is still possible. It has been in the past, but I think Facebook actually got rid of this option, because this has been used to discriminate in advertisements for apartments a couple of years ago. And there was court filings. There have been court filings, and Facebook changed the targeting possibilities. Yeah. So I'm not sure whether they got rid of it altogether. But even if not, I assume you have very limited possibilities to use this kind of indicators.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a general question. There was also a question about, how do you best target specific income groups outside the US, which allows you, to use a zip code at least to have an kind of an indicator of how rich or poor a kind of area is. But a lot of researchers are interested in income, and they want to either target high income or low income groups, and that it's the same question, right? These are sensitive issues. I mean, we as political scientists, we have the issue that Facebook will now limit political targeting and so on, and so that's all this kind of, what do you do? There was a question about people being interested in migrants from the Ukraine, or in your own research, right? So it's all this, like, what if the targets don't exist? What do you do then? So what would you recommend?
Yeah. So this is, of course, kind of a tricky question. And here I would refer again to my point, to the point I made earlier, that targeting is more than just the targeting variables, which helps you more in some of the examples you just mentioned than in others. So for Ukrainian migrants, I would use the Ukrainian language, of course, and minority languages, which are spoken in the Ukraine, and then in the advertisement text specifically mention, if possible, if I have the room, that I'm interested in people from Ukraine. This also will be increasingly necessary for research on political topics, or for specific communities which are more prone to self-identify than others, or which at least have less of a problem with it. So in some cases, this could, for example, apply to LGBTQ communities. In other countries, the exact opposite might be the case, that they will not be quick to identify as such. So this is actually an interesting question, how, to which degree we can counteract the upcoming limitation of targeting by becoming more specific in the design of our advertisements. So those were the aspects which hopefully we might be able to, the negative aspects to counteract by paying attention to the advertisement design. Regarding different income groups, that it gets even more tricky. A possibility that would come to mind is there is some interesting research based on Facebook also done by Ingmar Weber, who actually looked at the relation between income and the use of certain devices. So if we have more data on this aspect, the assumption being, if I recollect correctly, and I'm not sure that I do, but I seem to remember that the assumption is that Apple iOS devices are more likely to be used by people with higher education and higher income than Android devices. Then we could try to use this kind of information also in our targeting, because if I'm not totally mistaken, but I would have to check again, this is a differentiation that we can actually do in the advertisement manager. I think at least that we can target specifically users of AOI or Android devices.
Yeah, I mean, we had like another tool. So okay, so we have we have different tools to kind of filter through to specific research participants that we're interested in, right? So you have the targeting that is good for a lot of things, but not for everything. Okay, then you have your advertisement, the thing that the people on Facebook actually see, or the other platforms, right? So let's play with this. And then we had one more thing in our survey where we targeted conservative voters in Turkey, and that was just a filter, right? So you kind of showed us, like, if you, for of the completed surveys, how many actually fitted, you were interested in. What we did was also just to kind of, we had a question about who did you vote for in the previous election, and we just said, okay, thank you, the survey is now done for anyone who didn't vote for the AKP, right? So I think there's different tools, and I think we just need to kind of combine them all and to kind of get to the target population that we're interested in. Maybe just one more question on this topic, which is
may I just at one point, because I think this is a very important point that you just raised, and I didn't get to that because that's more in the area of questionnaire design. But certainly, and in general, every survey should include variables that allow you to make sure whether people actually belong to your target population. And I mean, based on my slides, you saw that we obviously did that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to differentiate, to make this differentiation. But I just want to add this. This is really important. Do not forget that.
Absolutely. And Michael Sanchez, I don't know whether he's still here. He actually wrote a paper on this showing that targeting works really better for some specific, kind of categories like age or gender than for others, especially the interest variables, education, these kind of things. It just works a bit less well. He actually put the link to his paper in the chat in case anyone is interested in this. Absolutely. Sorry, we will just keep on, kind of chatting a bit. Don't worry if you have to go. This is recorded anyway, so you can come back to this if this is really interesting for you. But we started a bit late, so I feel like we should use the opportunity to have Stefan here to have kind of just go over these questions. There's one more question on this, which is about protests. Social movements is a big field, and in it there has been also a lot of fantastic methodological work on how to best target protesters. Do you think, or do you know of kind of research that has used Facebook advertisement to target protesters in particular? And then there was a question kind of whether potentially location targeting could help. I don't know, any thoughts on that?
That's a tricky question. I actually, maybe I could write an email to that person, just the short answer, because I seem to remember a paper, but I would like to make sure. So I don't want to promise something that isn't true. There might be a project that used this or that targeted at least opposition people who support the opposition and might voice this in Facebook or other channels.
We just have a comment by Adriana saying that one possible way is using Facebook groups. So there's activist groups. This is something we haven't covered, right? Going into using, kind of the network structure of Facebook. So that is, potentially one way. The other is, again, if we can't use targeting tools directly, to use the advertisement text. We had like big protests now in Glasgow around the COP, to kind of use that, right? Did you participate in, any of the protests, around COP, comment, complete our survey or something like this, I think that again could potentially work. So we should really think beyond the tools that Facebook gives us for targeting, but also think about the art. That's really, really important. Okay, so then maybe just a few more kind of more specific questions beyond the targeting. What are your thoughts? You mentioned that briefly about multiple accounts. Do you think that this is an issue with targeting and recruitment of survey respondents? And what is your experience with this if people have multiple accounts? And how do you get around it?
Short answer, I cannot give really information on it. So I don't know whether it has been a problem in our previous research in terms of substantive results. We didn't see any of that, but we also have to look a bit more into quality indicators. But my assumption would be that especially in this regard, in terms of substantive results, this should not be too much of a problem unless you have a very short survey. So, or to say it the other way around, the longer the survey, the less probable that you will have people participating more than once. You could, of course, also use Facebook pixels as you did in your research. In this respect, you should, however, see whether there is data protection issue, so you should contact your ethics board. I know that it is more or might be more problematic in some countries than in others. Yeah. So
no, I think that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, something that also, like, it depends a bit. Kind of, we work with Qualtrics, for example, to then do the survey, and Qualtrics does recognize the IP address, right? And it has this ballot stuffing function. So even if people use different accounts, potentially, they might still use the same, device, and so then it would also recognize that. That somebody kind of comes from the same device. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's maybe a massive problem. There's a few more questions regarding your specific research projects. So again, everyone feel free to just get on with your day, but we will just go through this because obviously I couldn't answer these. So there was a question by Aneta about the budget. So you had, many different ad sets in your first example, for example, right, as a global study and so on. What did you do with budget? Did you allocate the same budget to each of the ad sets, or did you play a bit with this? Yeah.
That's a very short answer. We allocated the same budget.
Okay.
Small asterisks. Nearly to all. Sorry, it was a while ago. So I was a bit quick with my answer. We spent slightly less money on North America and Australia, because there again, other approaches are more successful than in the Global South. So yeah, but in general, there were no huge differences in the distribution of budget.
Yeah, I mean, budget is an interesting one. We talked a bit about this as well, right? It can help if for example, women are less likely to participate, right? So it makes sense to play with this, to kind of just put already, a slightly higher budget to those groups where you think it might be harder to convince them also to participate. And then related to this is also, do you think that the sample bias that you see kind of within the different regions might be driven by some countries kind of having maybe bigger populations or more Facebook users that are keen to participate? Do you think that was maybe one of the things that drove the kind of imbalances?
Definitely. I mean, that is that's basically the reason why we use different target regions. And that's what I hinted at before. So ideally, we would have used separate campaigns, ad sets for each country in the world, but then we would have needed a much bigger budget. So what we basically did was, as I said, we differentiated on each continent between 2 or 3 groups, and the decisive element for the allocation of countries to these groups was exactly the number of monthly active users in these countries. So on each continent, we had one group which contained if I'm not wrong, 5 to 7 countries with the highest number of monthly users, and then 2 other groups. By the way, this is also in more detail in the preprint that I linked on the last slide, and which was also linked on the webinar page. So if people are more interested, have a look in this. There's a long table which should give you more detailed information.
Great. Okay, Steffen. So last question about the last paper, which is that you show that the strategy 2, where you focus on industry, didn't really work very well. It worked much worse than the other 2. What do you think happened there? Like, what is your explanation?
Yeah. So what's my explanation? That's actually a good question. Again, that's not very satisfactory. I don't have one yet, because that's a project which we just finished a couple of months ago. I have to look more into detail there. But one obvious or similarly, or it seems at least obvious reason is, or could be, that the target group is also the smallest one. So, I mean, there are obviously more people in campaign 1, which was for the general population, and in the interest campaign than in the industry one. Yeah, but this cannot be the complete answer, as also in relative terms, this campaign did not perform as well. So a possibility is that we might have needed to put more money into it, which we were not able to do. So we have to investigate this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I think we should probably leave it here. Yeah, I mean, we did start about 10 minutes late and we're now about 20 minutes past 4. So thank you very much, Stefan, also, for kind of delving more into detail and, trying to answer all these, great questions by the participants. Just a reminder, we have one more session next Tuesday by Florian Vost from the LSE, who will cover how to conduct experiments via Facebook directly. And he will also go into detail about kind of different assignments, how to assign the different treatments, like individual versus geographic, and so on. And he will also talk a bit more about ethics, because that's obviously a big area here. We covered it a tiny bit in the first session, but Florian will talk a bit more about it. So hopefully you can also make it. If not, as with every session, we record it and put it on our website. So thanks again, Stefan, and hopefully we're going to see again many people next week.
Thank you very much.